is evidenced by this list of 78 Latvians from all walks of life. The notation says, politically unreliable, shoot them to death. There are no trials, no appeals. A mass grave in the courtyard of the Riga city jail. More than 15,000 men, women, and children, educators, doctors, ministers, students, laborers, are executed. It's the same sad story in Estonia and Lithuania. Molotov says the nonsensical talk about the Sovietization of the Baltic countries is only to the interest of our common enemies. Words are one thing, actions another. Communist imperialism marches on. In eastern Romania, Khrushchev and Commissar of Defense Timoshenko supervised the Red takeover. May 1st, 1941. In Red Square, Marshal Timoshenko entertains officers of the Axis powers. It begins to look as if Stalin and Hitler will divide the world. On June 22nd, frustrated by his inability to conquer England and not trusting Stalin, Hitler turns his forces on the Soviet Union. Because Stalin had feared to provoke the Germans, he ignored warnings of a Nazi buildup along his border. Caught completely by surprise, poorly led, and lacking the will to fight, the Soviet armies are decimated. Conveniently ignoring his own treacherous acts, Stalin appeals to the West for aid. Weeks later, he justifies his pact with Hitler to the Russian people in this way.
С такими вероломными людьми и извергами, как Гитлер и Риббентроп, не была ли здесь допущена со стороны советского правительства ошибка? Конечно, нет. Пакт о ненападении есть пакт о мире между двумя государствами. Именно такой пакт предложила нам Германия в 1939 году. Могло ли советское правительство отказаться от такого предложения? Я думаю, что ни одно миролюбивое государство не может отказаться от мирного соглашения с соседней державой. Если во этой державе стоят даже такие изверги и людоеды, как Гитлер и Риббентроп. Что выиграла и что проиграла фашистская Германия, вероломно разорвав пакт и совершив нападение на СССР?
Early days of the war, many Russians are confused as to exactly who the fiends and cannibals are. In village after village, the Germans are welcomed as liberators, freeing the Russians from the communist yoke. But then comes the incredible barbarism of the Nazi occupation troops. Some people have difficulty drawing a parallel between the brutality of Nazism and the brutality of communism. The victims have no such difficulty. These atrocities and Stalin's appeal to nationalism rather than to communism gives the Soviets a reason to resist, aided by some $11 billion worth of material from the United States. Stalin signs treaties to gain strength, first with the Polish government in exile represented by General Sikorski. Then with the Czechoslovakian government in exile in the presence of his president Beneš. These are just two of the more than 200 treaties and international agreements communists sign and break. General Sikorski, with the Duke of Windsor representing Great Britain watching, takes charge of the Poles on Russian soil. General Svoboda assumes command of the Czechoslovaks. As the war continues, Stalin becomes Uncle Joe, the faithful ally. With a straight face, he signs a summit agreement which states, "We look to the day when all peoples may live free lives, untouched by tyranny and according to their varying desires and their own consciences." But in Moscow, he has already established the Lublin Committee, dedicated to a communist Poland after the war. Soviet diplomacy. Words are one thing, actions another. While the Russian soldier battles Hitler, his communist leaders fight against freedom. In 1944, they unaccountably halt the Red Advance a few miles from Warsaw, where Polish resistance forces have risen in rebellion against the Nazi occupation. "Help us or we die," begged the patriots over the Warsaw radio. But the Red Army stands by, waiting for the future leaders of a free Poland, 200,000 of them to be massacred. And only then do the Reds move in. Stalin takes advantage of the change in the tide of war to satisfy his vengeance on 7 of his minority nations whose members may have been disloyal to him. He directs a mass genocide resulting in over 11 million victims. For example, these Tanu-Tuvinians, a proud and ancient people, completely obliterated, their very existence denied by the Soviet Union. When the war ends, the communists occupy all of Eastern Europe and 1/3 of Germany. Stalin means to hold his gains. All Red-occupied territories are ruthlessly plundered. The example of Mukden, Manchuria, where after 6 months of Red liberation, 5,000 factories are stripped of machinery for removal to Russia. The truth behind Khrushchev's statement, "We categorically refuse all that rests on loot, violence, and occupation." Stalin again signs treaties, this one with Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist representative. As this scene is being enacted, Stalin is secretly supporting the communist leader Mao Zedong. Soviet diplomacy. Meanwhile, Special United States Ambassador George C. Marshall attempts to restore peace in China. He negotiates a truce between the nationalist government forces represented by General Chang Chun and the communist guerrillas represented by General Chou Enlai. Paper promises, and the Reds gain valuable time to strengthen their forces. When Marshall leaves, they resume the war on a vastly larger scale. By the end of 1949, China falls to the Reds, another 700 million people under communist control. Lenin once said, "We shall reach Paris by way of Peking." During this time, 1945 to 49, Stalin has been beating the propaganda drums for disarmament. But his true policy is revealed in instructions given by the Communist International apparatus. The disarmament policy of the Soviet government must be utilized to support the only way toward abolition of war, arming the communists, overthrowing the capitalists, and establishing the communist dictatorship. Stalin's policy of a protracted conflict, the Cold War, is becoming evident. With about 5 million Red Army troops and 2 million internal security police in East Europe, no one punishes Stalin as he consolidates his control by tearing up previous treaties and signing new ones with his puppets. Romania's Dr. Groza and Dej, East Germany's Grotwald and Peak, Yugoslavia's Tito, Albania's Hodza, In most communist parades and rallies, it's not unusual for the dove of peace to go hand in hand with the reality of war. Bulgaria's Dimitrov, formerly head of the Communist International. Poland's Beirut. Hungary's Rákosi, who speaks of Soviet generosity. Without the unremitting kind support of the Soviet Union, the Hungarian popular democracy, and I may add all other popular democracies, would never have been created. Czechoslovakia's Gottwald. The Czechoslovakian story, a good example of subversion in action. The great liberal statesman Eduard Beneš, after 7 years of wartime exile, is unanimously elected president of the Second Czechoslovak Republic by the Constituent Assembly. But the communists, a militant handful, forced the formation of a coalition government and proceed to split and then wreck the opposition. To emerge the leading party in the cabinet under Premier Gottwald, a meeting of the communist-dominated General Federation of Labor is taking place. The Reds infiltrate the army and the trade unions. Gottwald denounces the anti-communist members of his cabinet. Zapototsky, chairman of the General Confederation of Labor, demands a general strike. The delegates vote. 2 committee members have the courage to abstain. Work stops. Czechoslovakia is paralyzed. Freedom dies as Beneš is forced to accept the resignation of the last anti-communist in the cabinet. And then he too resigns. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, a great patriot, still has illusions.
It's up to us, the so-called little people, and I personally proudly claim membership in that great mass of thinking and working citizenry. Come along with us, join us. Let's criticize together. Let's make suggestions together. Let's insist on being heard, and actions are bound to follow. Truth shall conquer if we give it half a chance. I'll be seeing you.
2 weeks after the takeover of Czechoslovakia, Masaryk is dead, allegedly a suicide. Beneš, who also thought he could do business with the communists, dies soon afterward. To divert attention from his next move, Stalin orders violence in South America. In Bogota, Colombia, Dr. Jorge Gatlin, Colombia's most popular political leader, is murdered. Communist handbills printed in advance blamed the murder on the government. Within 24 hours, 1,000 dead, 136 major buildings destroyed, the result of the communist-incited riot. Unexpectedly, Stalin blocks Allied access routes to Berlin. The flood of refugees fleeing from communism embarrasses him. Stalin conveniently puts aside his solemn promise during World War II for free access to the city. This time, however, the United States stands firm. Thousands of tons of food and supplies are flown into Berlin every day. Stalin is made aware that interference means war. He backs down. The roads are reopened. Mao Zedong arrives in Moscow to participate in Stalin's 70th birthday celebration, December 2nd, 1949. The new Moscow-Peking axis poses an ever more ominous threat to the free world. The communist narrator translates.
The most vital tasks at the present time are to fight the warmongers, strengthen good neighborly relations between the two great states, China and the Soviet Union, and thanks particularly to the correct international policy of Generalissimo Stalin. In the Presidium are leaders of the party and government, representatives of the various Soviet republics, and of the Communist and Workers' parties abroad.
Khrushchev proudly proclaims Stalin, the genius, leader, teacher, father of the nationalities, great industrializer, great collectivizer, creator of Soviet culture, careful gardener tenderly rearing the human beings in his charge. Nikolai Zvernik makes the introductory speech. To his left are Georgy Malenkov, first secretary of the Central Committee, and Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's Minister of Interior and State Security. Next to Stalin are Mao Zedong, Walter Ulbricht, Deputy Prime Minister of East Germany, and in a place of prominence, Nikita Khrushchev. In preparation for his next move, Stalin steps up the clamor for peace throughout the world. A rash of peace demonstrations breaks out. This is one of them. The communist narrator says,
on Berlin's Marx-Engels Square, the German youth demonstrate in defense of peace against the remilitarization of Western Germany. The German youth is greeted by the delegates to the World Youth Festival, representing 101 countries. Among those marching are 35,000 young peace champions from Western Germany who managed to get through Adenauer's police cordon. 2 million persons take part in the procession. In the evening, there's a youth meeting on the square. The speech of greeting is made by Walter Ulbricht, Deputy Prime Minister of the German Democratic Republic.
Youth everywhere are brainwashed.
У комунізм свої вітрила щасливий править Волгодон, і непоборна наша сила, яку не взяти у полон, щолом за це віддати. Звідкільця висігло, і хто могутній міг з'єднати серця у нас усіх, єдина мати, і звезда...
Communist narrators continue.
The artist borrows Prorokov's illustrations to Mayakovsky's verses about America. They lay bare the real nature of present-day America with its false democracy, lynch law, thirst for profits, and the brutalities committed by the militarists. These illustrations won the artist the Stalin Prize.
It for us is a
gay and noisy carnival fills the streets until the early hours of the morning. The people condemn the warmongers, enemies of democracy.
In communist North Korea, a nightmare of national brainwashing is taking place.
He supervises the work of a group of writers translating the classics of Russian literature and books on the Soviet Union. Among the first books earmarked for publication in the Korean language is a biography of Generalissimo Stalin.
And in Moscow, North Korean leaders absorb Soviet techniques. The Korean people are unimpressed. Tens of thousands flee to the democratic South. Korea becomes the Germany of the East. Stalin decides to do what he didn't dare to do in Germany: take control of the divided country by force. June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans launch a surprise attack. Their advance is spearheaded by Russian tanks. But once again, the United States stands firm. Stalin miscalculated. The Cold War becomes a hot war. American troops, later supported by forces from the United Nations, hold and then rout the North Koreans. Mao Zedong pours 1 million Chinese so-called volunteers into the fight. After 3 years of conflict and negotiations, agreement is reached. Lieutenant General Nam II signs for North Korea. American Lieutenant General William J. Harrison signs for the United Nations. The cost to the United States for stopping the Red aggression, 135,000 casualties and $20 billion. These are American soldiers, some of the 10,000 prisoners of war senselessly slaughtered by barbaristic communism. And these are South Korean soldiers. And the Reds retain control of the 15 million North Koreans. The Kremlin. Stalin's war, hot or cold, is stymied. He needs scapegoats for his failures. On August 12, 1952, 400 Jewish artists, actors, and writers are murdered. Next, leading Jewish doctors are accused of a plot to poison the Soviet leadership and of working for foreign intelligence. Stalin tells Ignatiev, the then Minister of State Security, if you do not obtain confessions from the doctors, we will shorten you by a head. Stalin instructs, beat, beat, and once again beat. Caught in the frenzy of his purge, Stalin now plans to liquidate his entire inner circle. Molotov, Malenkov, Beria, Mikoyan, and thousands more are threatened. But before the murders can begin, Stalin dies of a stroke. The end of a tyrant. At the bier, the beginnings of a struggle for power reminiscent of the death of Lenin. Again, a triumvirate. The heirs apparent are Molotov, Beria, and Malenkov, who now becomes premier. Khrushchev is still in the background, waiting. Within months, the new rulers are shaken by the first popular uprising against a red dictatorship. East Berlin, June 17, 1953. The sign says, "We want freedom." It starts with workers demonstrating against intolerable conditions and spreads rapidly until people of all classes are demanding democracy and an end to the communist regime. Part of the Iron Curtain is torn up. The red flag is hauled down over the Brandenburg Gate. The Red Army intervenes. Sticks and stones prove useless against Soviet tanks. For East Berlin, after 13 years of Nazism and 8 years of communism, one glorious day of freedom. The red flag goes up. For Secret Police Chief Beria, Berlin sounds a death knell. Khrushchev finally sees the chance to split the triumvirate and take over Beria's police power. Among other charges, Beria is accused of treason by his failure to foresee the uprising and is arrested. Khrushchev says, "It has now been established that this villain had climbed up the government ladder over an untold number of corpses. Beria is executed." Now, as Secretary General of the party, Khrushchev follows in the footsteps of his predecessors. The opposition, Premier Malenkov, on Khrushchev's right, is disgraced and forced to resign. His successor, Nikolai Bulganin, here with Marshal Zhukov, is a Khrushchev puppet, and Khrushchev soon succeeds him. Molotov is banished. Khrushchev staffs key posts with his own followers. Then, in a maneuver that astounds the world, apparently in order to conceal the truth of his connection with the shameful past, Khrushchev turns his attention to the overpowering image of Stalin. This is the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev delivers his secret de-Stalinization speech. Comrades, the cult of the individual acquired such monstrous size because Stalin himself supported the glorification of his own person. Was it without his knowledge that Stalin monuments were erected throughout the country? These memorials to the living? Was it without Stalin's knowledge that many of the largest enterprises were named after him? That many of the largest towns were named after him? The communist narrator continues.
The inhabitants of Varna, now known as Stalin, voiced their warm affection and loyalty to the great Stalin and the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev continues. And when Stalin asserts that he himself wrote the short course of the history of the all-Union Communist Party, the work created by a group into a book written by Stalin, this calls at least for amazement. His short biography is an expression of the most dissolute flattery. We need not give here examples of the loathsome adulation filling this book. They were all approved and edited by Stalin personally. Khrushchev continues. Stalin knew the country and agriculture only from films that dressed up and beautified the existing situation, and so pictured collective farm life that the tables were bending from the weight of turkey and geese. Evidently, Stalin believed it was so. The power in the hands of Stalin led to serious consequences during the war. To his leadership were dedicated many literary works and paintings full of fantasy. When we look at many of our novels, films, and historical scientific studies, they make us feel sick. Khrushchev continuing, all the more monstrous are the acts whose initiator was Stalin. We refer to the mass deportation of whole nations. The Kalmyk Autonomous Republic, the Karachi, the Chechen, Ingush. The Ukrainians avoided meeting this fate only because there were too many of them, and there was no place to which to deport them. Thus spoke Khrushchev. He avoids mentioning the Jews in whose persecution he himself is deeply involved, and Budapest is still to come. October 1956, Budapest, Hungary. The Hungarian Writers' Union is attacking the communist government for oppressing freedom, distorting the truth, exploiting labor, and abusing the farmers. Students by the tens of thousands denounced the Soviet occupation. They ripped the hammer and sickle from their flag. They demand democracy, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of the press and radio, general elections with a secret ballot. They march to the Budapest radio station to make their program known to the world. The student leaders are arrested and the crowd demands their freedom. Now the AVO, the Communist Security Police, opens fire. The first blood is drawn. The world has a new set of heroes, the freedom fighters, who rally during the night and win the support of the Hungarian army and the local police. Within 48 hours, Soviet troops enter Budapest. The Hungarians have a message for them. Russians, go home. Molotov cocktails, a homemade explosive, emphasizes the message. Eventually, the Soviets are forced to lift the siege of the Killian Barracks, where a hastily organized defense under Colonel Pal Malater has withstood a violent assault. The AVO, the secret police who have barricaded themselves in the Communist Party building, are taken prisoners.